So I teach, and right now we're not meeting face to face. We're doing distance learning, and I gave some of my students the assignment of responding to an article that was posted by Richard DiLorenzo, who's a theologian at Notre Dame. And it's an article online called Christians and the Coronavirus Prepare to Lose. And in this brief article, he challenges us to think about what it means to be Christians, what it means to follow someone whose modus operandi is to give it up, to give it away, not insisting on my rights or that people pay me back the things that I'm owed. Hey, I lost money on that flight, or I'm losing opportunities. I missed my trip. I missed my vacation. Or sometimes very serious in deep things. I know of people who've postponed their weddings, and of course there are going to be some people who lose their jobs, and or lose significant amounts of income, and there will be people who lose a lot more than that, because I think it's fair to say that more people are going to die before this virus scare is over. They're going to lose. They're going to lose. What does it mean as a Christian to approach the opportunity of losing, the threat of losing? Following Jesus entails being ready for that. Theoretically, that's what we're equipped for. Our Lord did it, and we're practicing giving away our rights and our entitlements, our privileges for the sake of others, so that we're able and equipped to lose and receive that, maybe, hopefully, a little more graciously, because of the example of Jesus Christ and because of what we're called to do. So one of my students was writing in response to this, and she said, when there are too few ventilators, or when there's not enough money to go around, or when there are too few supplies, uh, what do we do as disciples when we see the cost that other people are bearing to deal with these things? Will we choose to bear that cost ourselves when we have to do so? But most especially, will we be willing to share that cost with others? Because Christianity looks more like losing than it does like winning in the eyes of the world, at least. Well, of course, Christians are citizens of a kingdom beyond, but they're also citizens of this world. And so they experience the things that happen in this world as well. And down through the centuries, there have been many opportunities for faith to be challenged and for Christians to walk alongside their human brothers and sisters in all kinds of difficulties. So, any given year you wanted to pick, we could find something that I think would be telling and would be interesting. But I was thinking especially about uh, some catastrophes that happened in the third century, because I specialize in early Christian history. And this was before Christianity had become the big thing that it eventually became, right? Where many people in the Roman Empire converted to Christianity and all of that. This was while Christianity was still a minority religion. But in the Roman Empire, there was a massive pandemic in the middle of the third century. It happened in the 250s and the 260s. It came in waves. We're not really sure precisely what caused it. Theories are that it might have been smallpox outbreaks or maybe measles, but most people must not have had any immunity because it just devastated the population of the Roman Empire. At its worst, there were 5,000 or more people dying a day. And when you read some of the descriptions from that time about what people were going through, about what the symptoms were like, it was pretty horrifying. There was massive depopulation, labor shortages, disruptions to food chains. The Roman borders were falling apart. Everything was just collapsing. One of the areas that it hit hard was North Africa. And I'm thinking about a church in the city of Carthage where a church leader there, a fellow by the name of Cyprian, had to deal with this outbreak in his own congregation and to equip those folks for what they had to do amongst their neighbors in Carthage in North Africa. And in his day and his church, they did what it looks as though a lot of Christians around the Roman Empire were doing at the time. They were helping out. One of the things that early Christians emphasized about Jesus is that he was a healer. They loved that about Jesus. You can see this in the catacomb art. You can see it in their hymnody. They preach about it all the time. They were following the good physician. And if you follow a master who's a good physician, that gives you an imagination for being a helper and a healer, someone maybe who would attend to the sick, just like Jesus did. So the church at Carthage in the third century went out to tend the sick and did everything that they could, according to the medical knowledge they had at the time, making personal sacrifices to help people, to help families, to help sick individuals, to help the dying. And when we look at what happened in the middle of the third century, this was a tremendous witness to people who were not Christians, because generally speaking, the non Christians were pretty terrified about all this. The symptoms of these diseases were horrible, and it seemed as though if you were around the sick, you got sick. They didn't understand germ theory the way we do, of course. But here were these Christians, and they were doing whatever they could to help. They weren't terrified. They had this deeper measure of peace. Cyprian says that's because of their hope of resurrection. And they had this calming influence. Now, that peace of theirs and their willingness to help and serve was an extraordinary thing. But one of the things about that strikes me, and especially about Cyprian and his witness during the third century, that strikes me the most, has to do with the way Cyprian made sense out of what was happening for his people. Because when you get hit with that kind of catastrophe, it's natural to ask some questions, right? Like, why is this happening? And why is this happening to us? But Cyprian has a response that I think is really profound. And he doesn't answer the question in quite the way some people wanted him to answer it. He doesn't say, well, here's who started it, or the reason this happened because of this cause, and that's what's causing these things to occur. But instead, he says, these things are happening to see whether the well care for the sick, whether relatives will love their families as they should, whether masters will show compassion on ailing slaves, whether physicians won't desert the afflicted who are begging for their help, and whether the violent will repress their violence, whether the greedy, even through the fear of death, will quench the insatiable fire of their desire to acquire and possess more and share with others. And Cyprian is basically preaching this response to his congregation. Why is this happening? Cyprian says, that may be the wrong question. The question is, what does it mean? And the question is, who will we be? How will we respond? That's really what it's about. And so Cyprian in the 250s is changing the question that was on everybody's mind, and I think equipping his congregation with a kind of response, which wasn't just a verbal answer, but it was a way of being. It was a set of habits. It was a trajectory to follow, a life to embody. It wasn't about answering the question, why is this happening? Who's to blame? But for us as Christians, who are we supposed to be, and how do we act in the midst of it? Cyprian and his church embodied a particular kind of response, and it was to sacrifice themselves, honestly, for the sake of others. Using the knowledge that they had, they were willing to lay down their own rights, their own privileges, their own entitlements to find ways to serve in a difficult situation, even to the point of sacrifice and loss. I think that's what Cyprian and his church did, and a lot of other Christians in the 3rd century. It's one of the reasons many people became Christians during that time, because they were so impressed by that witness of peace and by the courage and fortitude Christians showed, their willingness to serve and even sacrifice themselves to help others. But also, they had a kind of response that made sense. Not getting bogged down in the blame game, but instead responding positively and constructively to help.